as a strategy for PSEG and exactly how you all look at it, because I can't think of anyone in our industry who's been more vocal about energy efficiency and what that really means. And that going forward, and when we talk about electrifying everything and putting everything on the grid is really going to be the enabler, right?
So when you think about the role that electricity plays in carbon emissions, the industry has done a phenomenal job of reducing those emissions. And right now we represent, I think it's about 30% of the emissions in the nation. So if all we did was clean up electricity, we'd still have 70% of our emissions to talk about. So the strategy, as you know, Brian, is to electrify the economy and clean up the electricity stack. Now, electricity today represents about 20% of the energy used in America. So it doesn't seem logical to me that we should simply quadruple the supply of electricity and hope that all of that is carbon free. It makes sense to me that as we electrify the economy, we think about doing that in a way that's highly energy efficient, whether that's homes, buildings, vehicles, industrial processes. And I think oftentimes we get enamored with the big project, the steel in the ground. It's absolutely essential. PSEG is engaged in putting steel in the ground. But I think we forget all too often about all of the little ways that electricity and energy gets used. It's not as glamorous, but the point that I try to make with people, nobody really looks forward to using energy. Energy is a means to an end. If you will, it's a tax on living. And if people could live their lives and use less of it, I think they're happier. And to me, it's a quadruple win. It's lower bills, it's less environmental impact, it's more jobs, and with the right regulatory system, it's shareholder value. And we're lucky in New Jersey. Every dollar we spend on energy efficiency makes the same impact on our bottom line as every dollar we spend on transformers, meters, and the like. I think it's an essential part of the solution set that often gets overlooked.
Ralph, I want to ask you that Brian Vascio, president of Capital Power. Brian, one of the most interesting things here is that you all said that you were going to be out of coal in 2023. So you got a plan for that. Can you talk about that transition? Because you all are doing so much, both in Canada and the U.S. Tell us your approach to that.
So we had made a decision a number of years ago that decarbonization was going to drive technology, it was going to drive the political environment. And as we looked forward, we saw that obviously coal was definitely on its way out. Natural gas was a tremendous transition fuel. So we've been on a track of reducing our emissions of our fleet over the last number of years. And one of the steps that we're taking is we are retiring our coal plants next year. Two of them, though, we are actually repowering. So we're taking 800 megawatts of coal and we're converting it into 14 megawatts of the most efficient natural gas you can get. And then we're adding carbon capture and storage on it after that. And so we'll actually be burying carbon by 2027, and our emission intensity is below 0.1. So, that's what we're doing in terms of retiring coal. Generally, the rest of the fleet, coal fleet in the province is converting to natural gas, which is quite inefficient. And as new, more efficient generation of renewables come in, they just sort of go over the cliff. But that's generally the path that Canada is moving on. But we're starting with 80% of the energy across the country is actually non-emitting today.
Well, you have a huge U.S. business, and I've got 3 EEI member companies here, so I'll spend a little bit of time selling you on membership since we're including you in a lot this week. I've got my vice chairman down here, Pedro Pizarro, and he would expect nothing less from me. Pedro, just talk a little bit about, in our industry, Edison really came out with a blueprint of what it meant for your future, and I haven't heard you yet, unless you talked about it earlier this week. I haven't heard you talk about that because it's really been something that the rest of our industry has looked to because it provided a pathway for them to figure it out themselves.
All these switches are different on these microphones. Glad you can hear me now. And by the way, Brian, I did find out that, that Brian and I have a director in common. So I may have one other influence point on that EEI membership. But in any case, with Edison International, we have Southern California Edison, a regulated utility serving 15 million residents in California. We also have Edison Energy, which is serving global clients on sustainability and the clean energy transition. At Southern California Edison, we are in California, and the state has been very forward-leaning and early on setting climate targets. So we have a law in California now that says that the entire economy will be net zero by 2045. When I became CEO 6 years ago, there was not a law yet, but it was already a target that had been established. And we were concerned that while it was a great target, and the state already had other pieces of that, renewables mandates, energy efficiency, et cetera, nobody had ever really put it all together and done the math on answering two questions. One, can you really get there? And two, what's the cheapest way to get there? And so we did that analysis and developed what we call our Pathway 2045. And we found out that using clean electricity to electrify a lot of the economy is the cheapest way to get there. That will require significant investment in California. We think they'll need the addition of about 80 gigawatts of central or bulk power renewables, 30 gigawatts of distributed renewables. That means about half of all rooftops in California will have solar on them, which would be a great thing. 30 gigawatts of storage at the bulk power level, 10 gigawatts at the distributed level. Continued focus on energy efficiency, a doubling of energy efficiency from current levels. And all of that to electrify a lot of the economy. We think 3/4 of passenger vehicles will be electric by 2045. We think 90% of building space and water heating will be electric. There are some areas that are tougher to electrify, long-haul transport, high thermal input industrial processes. And so for those, we do need clean fuels, like clean hydrogen. And that's what we've been happy to be part of EPRI's work with the Gas Technology Institute on the Low Carbon Resources Initiative. We'll also need carbon capture because we found that, as you look at the tools out there, it's cheaper to still allow some emissions to remain if you can offset them, right? Because at the end, we were optimizing on two things: getting to net zero and getting there with the lowest impact on the economy. And so we found that balanced approach, made a lot of sense. Final thing I'll say about it is that while it requires investment, significant investment in the power sector, we think it's about $175 billion that will be needed for renewables and storage, another $75 billion to enhance the wire system. Our average customer is going to see a net benefit because in 2045, that average customer is going to have, yes, a higher electric bill, rates will be a little higher, usage will be a lot higher, but when you add up the bill that really matters, total energy bill, electric, plus gas, plus gasoline, that bill is going to be 1/3 lower in real terms than it is today because an electric motor is a lot more efficient than burning gasoline in a combustion engine.
Wow. Leo Moreno, you have been really the driving force at AES around new technologies. And the bipartisan infrastructure law really had what I would consider a down payment with regards to new technologies. Tell us a little bit about AES's focus on long duration storage and storage in general, because you have managed to do this around the world, and everybody's looking to AES now as how we replicate that, take advantage of some of the Inflation Reduction Act and those tax credits, particularly the battery tax credit. But how's that changing your strategy and the way that you look at these new technologies?
Happy to talk about that. AES has been on a long transformation journey, right? From a company that was primarily coal and gas to a renewables company. Today, we became a leader in new technologies and renewables. We're signing about 5 gigawatts of renewable PPAs a year. That's 4 of those 5 are in the U.S., so we became a big player in the U.S. renewable space. But it's good to put in perspective the magnitude of the challenge here, just building on what Pedro and my colleagues were talking here. If you just look at the power sector, like you said, it's 25%, 20% of the emissions. In the US, you have 700 gigawatts of thermal assets. Renewables are 25% capacity factor, 30% capacity factor. So you need somewhere close to 3,000 gigawatts of renewables a year. In the US, we're building today maybe 30 gigawatts a year. So that's 100 years of work if you wanted to replace it all. So I think it became very clear to us that you needed to invest in new technologies, that storage needed to play a huge role here if you're going to decarbonize the whole system. And we turned the entire company towards that. And we're still in that journey. So now we're going big in hydrogen. We have big hydrogen announcements to do before the end of the year. Like Pedro said, in the long-haul transport, it's hard to see the lithium-ion energy storage playing any role. It's probably going to be a green fuel. So in this journey, we won't be able to do it in 100 years, right? We'll need a combination of many technologies to make this go a lot faster. And that was the driver behind the AES journey. And when we started this journey, within the first 1 or 2 years, our stock price doubled. Our investors really came behind us. You know, we started changing board members to board members that would support this journey. So it's been very rewarding, and but we'll still have to do a lot more because the scale has to be, 2-3 times what we're doing today.
Well, go a little deeper there. Just beyond energy storage, we had a huge investment made in CCS, small modular reactors, and electric transportation in the infrastructure law. Is there some other technology that you're looking at, beyond storage that is, whether it's hydrogen, what does AES look into in those new technology areas? Are you piloting anything?
Yeah, we're looking at some areas that are just to speed up the deployment of the existing technologies, such as automating solar, for example. So we have our own proprietary robot for solar, for deployment of solar. We have a technology called 5B, which is basically an accordion that rolls off the solar in half of the time as a normal solar facility. So we're doing a lot of that. And then on the storage side, we believe that first of all, lithium-ion can play a role up to 8 hours. We have a project in Hawaii where we have an 8-hour lithium storage facility that plays a great role, but it'll never play an interseasonal role between summer and winter. And for that, I think we'll need liquid fuels. So that's why we're going big in hydrogen. But we actually created an incubation unit called AES Next, where we kind of foment these innovations and we separate a portion of our budget to that. So there's a host of things coming behind that are things that can be big 5 years from now. And we try to roll out 1 or 2 of those per year.
Pedro, is there something that you're looking towards as that Edison's going a little bit, maybe a little bit of a bet beyond your blueprint? Is there anything beyond that you're actually saying, we're going to look in that direction because, you have a lot of, in California, intermittent resources. So is there something that you're looking at for reliability, resiliency, that may be something that's in your future?
Well, storage is certainly a big part of that, and just in the last year, Southern California Edison is actually in the process of completing development of $1 billion project, 535 megawatts. We see storage as a really critical, tool in the arsenal. I think beyond our own resources, though, we're also investing a lot of time in customer-side resources, because decarbonization really needs to be economy-wide. You need to optimize economy-wide. So whether it's the support that Edison Energy is providing to a quarter of the Fortune 100 as they're looking at fleet electrification or sustainability, or at Southern California Edison, we have today the U.S.'s largest suite of utility-based electric vehicle charging programs of almost $1 billion in investment that's being made. That's all going to support customer needs. Passenger vehicle charging for medium and heavy duty vehicles. The next wave of this for us is an application that SCE filed last December for a nearly $700 million program to go install 250,000 heat pumps in the next several years throughout our territory. Now, we view heat pumps as one of the critical technologies for decarbonization. As we look at not just 2045, but as we look even closer at 2030, California has another law that requires the state's economy to achieve a 40% reduction by then. We published a white paper last year called Mind the Gap right before Glasgow that looked at how's California doing. And the answer was, well, it's done pretty well. It's reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 1% a year over the last decade, while the economy grew 3%. But in order to get to the 40% mark, it had to quadruple that rate of emissions reduction starting last year. Hasn't quadrupled yet, right? And so we view buildings actually as being one of the major contributors to closing that gap. So putting a lot of effort into trying to bring more of those heat pumps to our customers.
Well, Ralph, let me ask you, because you were really in the path and took the real brunt of Superstorm Sandy. So when we think about 1 in 50-year events or 1 in 100-year events, how's PSEG sort of adapted and looked at that in general? Because you've made resiliency a part of your business model now, and I think everyone right now is trying to replicate that.
Yes, so I've often told people the only thing that the science got wrong about climate change is that it's come upon us faster than we expected. We had, as you correctly pointed out, in October of 2012, Superstorm Sandy. And basically what happened is it flooded all of the low-lying regions in our service territory, and New Jersey being an old state, industrialized along the low-lying regions. That's how you transported goods. So we lost 90% of our 2 million customers literally in the span of a half an hour. That, in combination with a prior Hurricane Irene, which didn't get as much attention, resulted in FEMA redrawing the floodplains and the 100-year storm, and et cetera, et cetera. So we then took all of those new maps and lifted. It wasn't sophisticated technology. We just lifted the equipment off the ground in those regions that were now under threat. Sadly, about a year and a half ago, we had another hurricane, Ida, which was another mega flood event. And we lost 30 people in New Jersey. 30 lives were lost as a result of that flooding. And EEI was kind enough to give us the Edison Award this year because not one of the substations that had been affected in Irene and Sandy were affected during Ida. And as a result, the 90% of the customers who had lost power during Sandy, none of them lost power during Ida as a result of flooding. We obviously had some trees come down. So it was a massive program over 10 years of major, major investments. And given where we are nowadays, adaptation and resiliency is going to require that kind of expenditure.
So I want each of you to answer this question because I know how Pedro would answer it in our industry. But we've heard earlier about Justice 40 and environmental justice initiatives and, really everything with regards to the new laws in the U.S., the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act have huge components of environmental justice in there. And Brian, you all have been a leader in the communities you serve on that. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about your approach to it.
So as we're looking at it and the different elements that have come into play, obviously the cost to consumer is huge. And I think one of the things that's happened, obviously there's significant expenditures and policy direction towards renewables, but also other technologies which are key to keeping particularly dispatchable energy in play. And we think that's a real key to keeping costs low and ensuring that we do have an equitable transition in time, because as costs rise, wealthier consumers can bear the cost. Consumers who are not as well off are typically ones that bear a disproportionate amount of that cost. So what we're seeing, and as we look forward, we expect that there'll be a significant amount of recognition that dispatchable energy is required. And because of that, you'll see costs staying relatively moderated. And when you look at an area like we live in Alberta, we have periods of time where it's 30 below zero for 30 days and there's no wind. So what are you going to do? And that's where hydrogen and other liquid fuels, and there's a lot of time and effort being put in by our governments to develop those other liquid technologies, plus carbon capture and storage, to be able to support that, to be able to support people in that kind of an environment.
So Brian, as you know, we've committed to being net zero on Scope 1 and Scope 2 by 2030. And we are in the process of applying to the UN Race to Zero by September of next year to include Scope 3. The actions we've taken so far is we've closed our coal plants. Our coal plants were in low-income areas. We've closed 4,000 megawatts of inefficient gas plants and oil plants that were in highly urbanized areas. We said, okay, so that's fine. We shut those things down, and that will reduce the effect in those communities. But what else can we do? For reasons that I don't agree with, New Jersey invested heavily in rooftop solar as its first attempt to mitigate climate change. Those rooftop solar installations typically cost about $400 per megawatt hour to produce electricity. That's insane. They're on the homes of people who on average had a household income of $120,000 a year, which meant they were being subsidized by the average American who has half of that household income and the average New Jerseyan who is at about $70,000. So we said, look, we're not huge fans of solar in New Jersey, but if you're going to do it in New Jersey, at least let it be grid connected. So I believe we're still the number one owner of grid connected solar in New Jersey. Then we said, but this isn't the right thing to do at this price. Even though it's less expensive connected to the grid, it's still not financially attractive. We then looked at energy efficiency. And there's this anomaly in the case of energy efficiency that the people who need it the most are the people who can afford it the least. So we said, let's get away from these grant programs, which give out modest amounts of income to people who can already afford this, and let's just put this in rate base. So we've now gone from a modest amount of investment, $30 million a year, to $300 million a year in rate base on energy efficiency. And then we doubled down and said, not only are we going to increase the energy efficiency that go to low-income communities, we're going to employ the people in those communities to do the work in those communities that have the old housing stock. So environmental justice has been a huge part of our journey and will continue to be a huge part of our journey in achieving these net zero targets and these science-based targets that are part of our race to zero.
I want to touch on this local community aspect. We have maybe 400 projects in development in the U.S. And this past 3 months, I'm going around doing ribbon cuttings of projects. And the reality is that renewable development, the energy transition, is a huge element of socioeconomic development. Each of these projects brings 10, 20, $30 million of tax revenues to the local communities. And this goes to schools, it goes to community benefits, and people are so happy to welcome those there. Now, look at the big picture. At the American Clean Power Association, we did a mapping of all the counties in the U.S. against solar and wind resources and compared that with the income level. And it turned out that there's a huge correlation of the counties with most resources with the lowest income counties. So it's a huge opportunity to develop those. And if you look at the IRA, when they came with the concept of energy communities for communities that are having retiring coal or oil or disadvantaged communities, it's exactly to direct that investment to those communities. So I think the opportunity is tremendous. Going back to the numbers I mentioned, 3,000 gigawatts, that's probably $3 or $4 trillion that we'll have to invest in the economy, and a lot of it will go to the communities. So I think we have to play a real big role in terms of environmental justice.
This is an area where I'm really proud of our industry because we've seen a real commitment to, I'll start with diversity and equity and inclusion, and that translates into care for our communities. In the case of Southern California Edison, I think I shared in a prior panel with you, Brian, that about 1/3 of our residential customers qualify for low-income assistance. And so it's really important that programs recognize that those folks are also some of the folks who are being most impacted by climate change impacts. And in California, we're feeling climate change. We have the issue of wildfires, which has been dramatic. And Ralph, your example about racing the substations, a way of hardening, we've had to do our own hardening, and in the last 4 years, we've hardened to help reduce the risk of major wildfires created by our infrastructure by about 65 to 70%. That includes for a number of communities that are, again, just most impacted communities. But more broadly, we want to make sure that the clean energy transition is one that doesn't leave any communities behind. So when you look at our programs, our $400+ million program for passenger vehicle charging infrastructure, half of that funding is going to low-income and disadvantaged communities. When you look at the building electrification application I mentioned earlier for the heat pumps, 88% of that is going to residential customers, with a major portion of that going to low income. One other point I'd like to make on this is that while we are talking about this under the banner of climate change and decarbonization, it's not just about that. There's other benefits, and in particular, air quality is a critical one. In Southern California, we have the ports of Long Beach and LA on the coast. We have about a 50-mile trek out to the big distribution centers inland. In between those two, there's a bunch of low-income and disadvantaged communities that are getting the brunt of the impact of all those diesel trucks leaving pollution behind and making that local air quality so awful, right? And so when we think about the benefit of the clean energy transition, and particularly, transportation electrification, in this case, the heavy-duty transportation, that's going to have a major benefit in helping to clean those communities. So whether it's providing, subsidy support to help communities adapt and adopt clean energy technologies, or whether it's adopting technologies that will help clean the air, bring benefits, this needs to be done with an equity mindset. Final thing I'll say is that just because Ralph brought up solar, we're seeing this whole debate around energy metering in California right now. And it's one where really that's also an equity issue. Because what we're seeing today is that solar customers are getting a benefit through subsidies that's being paid for by non-solar customers. Higher number of our solar customers today tend to be able to be more affluent in affording the solar. Higher proportion of those who are non-solar or low income. And right now we have a massive wealth transfer taking place at a price level that under a revised decision, proposed decision that the Public Utilities Commission issued just this week, that would mean that we'd be paying about 8 times for rooftop solar compared to what we pay for central station solar. We think there needs to be an incentive, a subsidy for rooftop solar, but it needs to be right-sized so that it's fair to the people who are paying for it. So that's another lens on how we make sure that this transition is equitable for all.
That's a great point, Pedro. So for our audience and our audience virtually, the two gentlemen on the end, Pedro Pizarro is going to be Edison Electric Institute's next chairman in June, and Leo Moreno is going to be America's Clean Power Association next chairman. So we've got some power in the room, no pun intended here.
That just means we sign up for extra work.
Yeah, exactly. But just let me put you both on the spot. You're going to be leading, huge organizations, and as far as an industry is concerned, what do you think will be some of the issues that you'll be focused on during your chairmanship? I think that's something that you probably thought a lot about as you see other leaders in those roles now, and also what's going to be timely. I don't know when you're taking over, Leo, but Pedro takes over in June. But give us an idea what you both might be thinking about, what would be top of mind as far as the industry is concerned.
For us in the renewable space, the main problem is that the system to develop process in the U.S. is clogged for many reasons. Permitting is a big one. All different layers of permitting from local to state to federal are delaying the projects, and people are very concerned with that. The number of projects that exist relative to the ones that will actually be implemented, the ratio today is about 10 to 1. So when we develop our pipeline, we have about 50 gigawatts. We say, okay, maybe 10% of those will see the light of day because of permitting and transmission, other issues. So permitting is one. The second is the interconnection processes that are clogged everywhere. California closed the queue, PJM closed the queue. MISO had 150 gigawatts filed in the past month or so. And the process for interconnecting a project is not prospective. So the ISOs are not looking into the future and giving signals to developers, but anyone can file anything. And in 2 or 3 years, you're going to learn if your project is feasible or not. That's the number 2. And the number 3 is the NIMBYism. The communities are becoming more averse to having renewables in their backyard. and that's becoming the land process much more competitive and more difficult. So if we want to take renewables from the 30 gigawatts a year that we're talking about to 60 or 90, these things are becoming huge bottlenecks. So that is the big challenge that we're thinking medium term. Obviously short term, there's a lot of implementation of IRA, things like that, but medium term is the bottlenecks to scale the industry.
I think for EEI, we certainly share, all of those concerns. Let me focus on some other ones as well. First is to focus on the customer. Right? This is all about the customer. Second, the clean energy transition. There's deep commitment across all of our members. When you look at power sector emissions, they are, I think, 36% lower as of 2021 than they were in 2005. Our industry actually surpassed the goals of the original Obama Clean Power Plan. But we know we have a lot more work to do, and we need to go put the bipartisan infrastructure bill money and the IRA money, need to put that to work in our communities. I think it's a big focus for our membership. There's some details that need to be figured out, right? The law, particularly the IRA, set some broad parameters. Now there's implementation of the tax credits to the tax code in Treasury, so we'll be very focused over the next year on making sure that we lend our voice to that. And then maybe a final one I'll say is we recognize this is a period where affordability is crucial. We have communities and customers that have been battered by COVID, and now they're dealing with an inflationary period. But that's where that analysis that I shared earlier from Edison about how the clean energy transition ends up being more affordable for customers in terms of the total energy bill and the end result is so valuable, because I think that all of us will be experiencing regulatory pressures in each of our states where some folks might be saying, well, you don't really need to invest in this particular program right now. Why don't we wait a little bit? At the same time that climate change is increasing, where we need to focus on mitigation, we need to focus on adaptation, and we know that in the end, the cost of action today will be a lot less than the cost of inaction. And so I think we want to take on the challenge of making sure we're communicating well with our communities, with our customers, and importantly with our regulators on the value of the investments that America's investor-owned utilities need to make on behalf of our customers.
Hey, Ralph.
So Brian, one of the things that I'd like to emphasize that relates to some of the comments that my colleagues made is, so why are we at COP, right? I mean, we serve 2 million customers in New Jersey, 1 million on Long Island. Candidly, Pedro and I see each other 4 times a year at EEI meetings in the States. On February 24th, natural gas prices in New Jersey were about $2.50 an MMBTU. About a month later, they were $8 an MMBTU because something happened in Ukraine. The inflationary environment we're realizing right now is a combination of monetary policy, fiscal policy, but rapidly rising energy prices, which get into everything from the clothes we wear to the food we eat. So New Jersey is part of a global energy system. And the conversations we have with members of Congress are very well informed by the participation that we have here, and the things that we propose to do with our state regulators are extremely well informed by what we learn here. How many times have you heard people say, what's the sense in the U.S. being aggressive on decarbonizing if China's not going to achieve net zero by 2060 and not going to peak until 2030? Well, that may be true, but China leads the world in wind, solar, and nuclear installation, in electric vehicle deployment. So China has a foot in each camp. They are both a developed nation and a developing nation. And the developed nation part of China is going to eat our economic lunch if we don't act more aggressively in terms of advanced nuclear, in terms of permitting these facilities that we need to build and learn from. We can't have the NRC approving only one SMR design as of November of 2022. So as we interact with the international community in what is truly a global energy system, we bring these lessons back home to inform policymakers. And I think it worked a little bit less. You look at the phenomenal improvements that were made in the trifecta, as you referred to it, And now we have the decade of, what did you call it, deployment?
Decade of decision.
Decade of doing or something of that sort. And hopefully we can get the permits underway and progress in terms of actually deploying those thermostats and deploying that metal in the ground. So recognizing that we are part of a very much interconnected system is a critically important part of our purpose of being here.
Hey, Brian, can I just tack on one more point on Ralph? That's an excellent point. And going beyond the energy sector, this is about American competitiveness. So, you mentioned China. All the batteries in our billion-dollar project are coming from China. Certainly, the CHIPS and Science Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill are meant to help stimulate the U.S. economy. Think about electric vehicles. Fortunately, some of those are being made here, but China's production, I think, is still much larger than American production. So this is something that, in my view, should be bipartisan, right, or nonpartisan. And whether you do it because of climate change or you do it because of American competitiveness, either way, the U.S. needs to be taking a more active role in making sure we can develop and manufacture those technologies as part of a global economy.
Yeah, I'm going to get to all four of you on this one because several of you alluded to it with regard to transmission, permitting, and siting, being able to move these resources to the people that are using them. You've all referred to that. I would consider it something left to be done, right? I'm not really sure Congress is going to get to that, but talk about what that really means for your plans, because I think that you can have all of these grants and tax credits out there, but then how are you really going to make that happen if you're missing a vital component, that really is so necessary? So, Brian, do you have a thought about that?
Sure, and I think it goes the same on both sides of the border because we have a lot of renewable development in the U.S. and we're actually in 9 states right now. What we find, and I think the point was made earlier around NIMBYism, is a real challenge. We're finding that in a lot of areas where we believe that there was a very positive sentiment towards renewables, elements develop that really create a lot of pushback. So that in combination with, in some jurisdictions, long queues for interconnection, and there's just the aspirations are well ahead of the ability to execute and move forward. And I think that's a big challenge for the entire industry. Again, on both sides of the border, there's so much that these organizations want to get done, and there's just structurally challenges that just prevent it from moving as quick as it can.
Ralph, how do you think about that with regards to PSEX plans? And that's still a vital part of it, but what are you thinking about?
Yeah, so everyone knows that we need to have strong, effective regulatory oversight. If you don't have that, you're strained to achieve public confidence in your facility's safety, its reliability. But does it make sense for Boston to be importing LNG to meet its winter gas demand? I mean, that is sort of, it's almost comical. Well, why is that? Because we can't build pipelines. Does it make sense for us to be at COP and not think about how America could mitigate China and India's plans to build 600 coal plants? Why is that? Well, our LNG export facilities are running at 100% capacity. So the permitting issue is very broad range. It's enormous breadth. It is definitely transmission to bring domestic renewable supply to domestic users. It's LNG facilities to keep a very critically important bridge fuel, natural gas, coming out of the ground and getting to people who would otherwise use coal. It's getting advanced nuclear cycles approved at the NRC so that we can deploy that technology here and abroad. So there's a whole series of regulatory oversight issues that need to be grappled with, not done away with, not undermined, again, because you want that public confidence in the effectiveness of these regulatory agencies. But boy, there's a lot of work to be done in that area, Brian, to be sure.
Leah, you have projects around the world. I can see where this would be an impediment in your U.S. business, but tell me about what are some of the things that you think about where you do business in other countries where you're thinking we don't have that issue there. We only have it in the U.S. because it's an issue, right? As far as permitting and siting and those issues. What do you see the disconnect being?
Yeah, I think if you look at the numbers, right, in the U.S., we had in Q3 we had actually 23% less renewables deployed than last year. It's the lowest quarter since 2019. If you look at this year, we have about 30 gigawatts of projects that are delayed. And they're delayed due to a multitude of reasons, interconnection, permitting, but the trade issues. The supply chain has been completely clogged in the US. It is incredible, really, that they have 30 gigawatts that are stopped. So the rest of the world doesn't have this because the rest of the world has a more integrated supply chain. So what we've seen at AES is that when it started becoming so difficult to bring equipment to the US, we just directed it to other countries. So that creates a competitive disadvantage for the US. This year we launched a consortium to buy US manufactured solar panels. The consortium is going to buy 7 gigawatts a year, so 25% of the US market. It turns out there are no companies that want to create that supply chain in the US. It has been very difficult to move that forward. So I think this is kind of us shooting ourselves in the foot, making the supply chain unfeasible. And that is starting to go to other parts of the supply chain. So for example, high voltage equipment. To get breakers to interconnect the projects, it used to take 4 weeks. Now we're getting lead times of 70 weeks, 7-0, to deliver the equipment. So that is an area where the rest of the world is ahead because the supply chain is connected, right? So that's one of the things we have to resolve in the shorter term. We need to have a supply chain that is stable and scalable, right, in the next several years.
I agree with all the comments. Let me take it in a little different direction, though. Our processes take a long time. Transmission line might take 10 or 11 years to get built. That's maybe a couple of years of construction. Probably 9 years or so of the whole permitting, siting, regulatory approval process. That whole structure, I would argue, is built on a model where you could have pretty good certainty about the need for the project and you had lots of time to plan for it. That was in a much more steady Eddie world. We're in a different world now, right? And we're seeing the impacts of climate change are introducing not only a direction, but a level of volatility that we haven't seen before, right? So being able to predict need, which is, part and parcel of the utility or really the regulator model, that sense of having high confidence in that prediction and then basing every decision on that and being able to take a lot of time to do it, that doesn't work now, right? Because we have to respond to a series of climate threats that are just a lot more volatile. We never expected, nobody ever expected that California would have the scale of wildfires that it started having in 2017. Nobody expected the extent of the heat waves that we saw in 2020 and again in 2022. A bad heat wave used to be 5 days over a lot of California. A big heat wave now is 10 days over the entire West. And, you understand having heat in California. Our colleagues in Portland, Oregon, we're seeing temperatures of 110. Never had that, right? And so I think part of the reform that's needed is regulators also understanding that we need to take more risk in what things get permitted and approved. We need to build ahead. You can't just build in time. We need to be building ahead and be building for a more stochastic set, broader set of probabilities, as opposed to saying that we are going to get this thing perfectly mapped out and fully proven down to the third decimal. I know that sounds a little odd to say, right? Because we want to make sure we're being wise with customers' money, and we absolutely need to do that. But we need to recognize that we are now planning for a regime that hasn't been planned for before. It's changing, and what we used to think of as tail risks, that tail is coming more and more in to the broad part of the curve. It's a different world.
I want to dig a little bit because I think the supply chain issue is really an interesting one, because here we've heard about the Made in America movement with regards to these laws and really what they're funding. But we all know that's going to take a while, right, to get that manufacturing up. Leo, that's a great point on solar, right? Because I remember when Tesla first said, oh, we're going to build this manufacturing facility. I think that one was in upstate New York, I believe, and we never heard another thing about it. But just with regards to supply chain, Pedro, you're active in the Electricity Sector Coordinating Council, and there are so many things dependent upon the supply chain. Electric vehicles right now, you have a huge bottleneck with regards to the semiconductor chips that need to be manufactured to make those vehicles. But there's a whole list of other things when it comes to grid technologies in the supply chain. Can you talk about that a little bit? Just, I know you all rely on that government partnership, but is there something that you think about that, looking at it a little bit different, trying to accelerate that a little bit more? Because I don't think any company is going to be able to reach their clean energy goals if you've got issues like that standing in the way.
Yeah, a couple of quick thoughts on that. One, it's been really helpful to be part of EEI because and part of the ESCC. Now, that wasn't for Brian. Sorry, we're not beating up on it. Being part of the ESCC, we've had a whole, call it a tiger team on supply chain. So we've had the chief procurement officers of all our companies come together to really get our arms around the extent of the supply chain issue. And Leo quoted some of those delivery times for transformers right now. We're all seeing that, right? So I think step one is understanding the scale of the problem. That then also allows us to send the right sort of demand signal to suppliers to try and get that manufacturing capacity built. A different angle, though, that we see from ESCC is that where the supply comes from is important in terms of not only physical security but also cyber security. And so at the same time that we're looking to access supply wherever it's coming from in the globe, we're mindful of the risks that supply from certain places might have, right? Because the reality is that a transformer isn't just a passive transformer anymore. It might have a lot of electronics built into it. It might create some cybersecurity, access issues. And so that's another place where the partnership with the federal government has been critical, right? In getting access to intelligence, getting a sense of where those risks might be, and how we can protect our customers, protect the industry, from that. So, I think final point is that there's the near term and there's the long term. And so we certainly, welcome the administration's focus on Made in America. It's good for American competitiveness. At the same time, we also welcome the focus on the energy transition goals. And so that's where the reality is we don't have a U.S. supply today for many of these materials. We need to keep moving on the clean energy transition. We need to access supplies from outside of the U.S. at the same time that more U.S. capacity gets built.
Right. Leo, you're the one that brought it up. So is there another area with regards to supply chain that AES is concerned about other than domestic manufacturing? Is there another area that you feel like that's going to slow us down right there?
Yeah, I think that the big clog this year was on solar, but now batteries is the next layer. So what's going on in batteries today is if you want to procure a large supply of batteries, the suppliers can't even price the batteries to you. They want to price it based on an index. And this index is only going to be fixed a year from now. So you don't even have price certainty. And what's happening with all the developers can't bear like a metals index risk. So they're trying to pass that to the customers. So now you have people like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft receiving a contract that has a metals index in the contract, right? So that is becoming very difficult to manage. So solar was already clogged, batteries were having the price uncertainty, and now that's going to all the high voltage equipment. So like Pedro's saying, it's basically the entire supply chain. And we have to develop paths to scale up using resources where they're available at the same time as we build an almost entirely domestic, I like to call it domestic and allied country supply chain, because you can have allied countries that provide stability, but it can't be countries that can raise trade issues in the future, because that is an unstable supply chain.
Well, just to be able to point out, because you mentioned battery, but Beth Viola wrote the battery credit language that came in the IRA, so we have her to thank for that. But hopefully in the future, that will ease some of that sort of the affordability issue around batteries and the certainty there that you talk about. Ralph, is there some part of that you think about with regards to supply chain and just generally what you're looking at?
You know, once again, I think that this is a complex issue. If you think about offshore wind, New Jersey has issued contracts for 4,000 megawatts of offshore wind. The dominant players are a Danish company and a Dutch company. There is no supply chain for offshore wind in the United States fully developed yet. Part of the problem is something called the Jones Act, which says you can't use a non-U.S. flagged vessel to take stuff from a U.S. port to another U.S. port. I'm sure there are reasons why the Jones Act makes sense for certain industries. I'm not smart enough to say it doesn't make sense. But for this particular industry, it's impairing the ability to make use of an existing supply chain. We talk about manufacturing competitiveness. You know, part of the things that we've been advocating as a company in Congress, which isn't going too far, is to eliminate the United States' high cost of labor by capitalizing on the United States' low cost and sophisticated degree of technology by imposing a border adjustment tax with a carbon tax in the United States, right? That would level the playing field from a manufacturing point of view. So there's all sorts of complexities that involve public policy and how it stimulates or impairs the development of a supply chain for new industries.
Well, I want one step further. Don't put that down. So, you know, last year at the COP, and I know that you have been the voice in the industry with regards to a price on carbon. Can you just talk about that a little bit? And, you know, you're sort of on your way out at PSAG, and but that's been a real focus of yours. I would say the two things that you've sort of been the cheerleader on have been efficiency and a price on carbon.
Yeah, and I can declare victory on efficiency. That's a humbling defeat on the price on carbon. So a quiz that I give audiences is I'm just going to pick on New Jersey because that's where I'm from, but don't get snarky because I could do this for every one of your states. In New Jersey, is the price on carbon $400 a ton, $30 a ton, negative $125 a ton, or $100 a ton? And the answer is all of the above. Because in the absence of a price on carbon, we fall in love with certain technologies and we say, let's do this. So rooftop solar is positive $400 a ton. Energy efficiency is negative $125 a ton. A class 1 REC is $30 a ton. Offshore wind is $100 a ton. That's crazy. That's a very inefficient economic system. If you had a price on carbon, maybe the right thing is to retire a coal plant. It probably is. But maybe it's to change our agricultural management practices. Maybe it's to change the way in which we cook in restaurants. I don't know. I'm not smart enough, but the market is. And the most frustrating part is when you talk to members of Congress, they say, you're right, but we can't get it passed.
Okay, we're coming to close with this panel. So, Brian, I'm going to start with you and go down here. But just tell me a little bit. We've all heard this before. You know, I think that Pedro kind of mentioned it with regard to his concern and his thoughts about his customers with regards to affordability. And, you know, we have rising energy prices across the country right now, maybe because of something happened in Ukraine, maybe for, you know, inflation, other reasons. But what's your chief concern with regards to the business and how you're looking at, you know, the business going forward? What keeps you up? What's front of mind for you?
So probably the largest thing that's impacting us now, because of, you know, we're a competitive generator, so cost is extremely important in terms of building our business. So we're very affected by supply chain costs. It's huge for us, you know, on the renewables competing in the United States. But you know, in addition to that, yeah, as you're looking at, you know, cost curves that are going up, it's becoming much more expensive. And it's creating, you know, significant issues for, you know, cost of energy for consumers. So that's a pretty much our number one issue right now. And one of the things about with supply chain that's a little bit different for us is we're also running into huge labor shortages. Like we're having calls for skilled labor, and we're getting them at 60%. Like, it is a huge problem, and I think as the economies start moving more and more towards electrification and building out the grid and other things, I think people are going to see, to varying degrees, that same issue. And I would put in a plug for carbon price. We've been in a carbon price regime for 15 years, and it has had a lot of flaws, but it works. It absolutely works. So, no, it's a very good development, and it does move the dial.
Ralph, you owe me a drink for that.
So my number one concern would be the regulatory process broadly defined, but I must put in a plug for our industry. I can remember when I first became CEO 15 years ago, I was arguing with some of my colleagues about the need to regulate mercury. And I thought I'd stepped into an alternate universe. I was like, are you kidding me? Is there a debate on here? And now the industry's leading the way on something like carbon, and that's just phenomenal progress that I'm so proud of us for having accomplished.
I think from my side there's a supply-demand imbalance for clean energy today. The demand from customers is higher and higher. The number of companies that have to go 100% green, you see the announcements here at COP. You see more companies going to Scope 2, Scope 3. So the demand is higher and higher, but the deployability of the projects is just not happening. So today, if we have a project anywhere, 2 years, 3 years ago, you could run an RFP and 50 people would be bidding projects. Today, if you have any project, you can sell it like this because there's a supply-demand imbalance. So my biggest concern is the deployability. I think the demand is going in the right direction, but the ability to actually build is not.
Is that better now? Okay. It's a delay or something. If I could wave a magic wand, I would ask for a sense of urgency, shared sense of urgency. And I think our industry has it, which is a commitment to make the investments that are needed for climate. But we put out a white paper a few months ago called Adapting for Tomorrow. It looked at the climate impacts that we expect to come to California by 2050. It's scary, Brian, right? Almost 3-foot sea level rise. Hot days, the top 1% hot days will be 7% more prevalent by 2050, and probably worse. Floods, droughts, more wildfires. And that's a climate change that's locked in already, right? So we need to continue to working with urgency to make the investments that will help bend that curve, and the investments that will help us adapt to the curve that we already have to live with. So again, I'm proud of the industry's commitment to that. We need to see the same commitment from our customers, from stakeholders, from regulators, from policymakers. We saw a good step with the federal government. Let's keep going.
Well, Pedro, I got a good look at your priorities when you're chairman, so I'll report all those back and get started on those right away. Right at Caroline, we'll get started on that. Thank you all, 4 great leaders in our industry. Appreciate you being here. We've got 264 people joining us virtually, so thank you for joining us well. And all of you here in this room, we appreciate you being here as we competed against President Biden tonight. So thank you.